I believe that nothing in life happens by chance, and it's no accident that you're listening to me right now. My name is Olivia Migalusi, and my purpose is to help as many families as possible create relationships they love. And with that in mind, I'm making this little video to share with you some parenting tips. First, we'll talk about what needs to be addressed when your child is acting out. Second, I will give you a method to deal with your own stress when your kid is driving you mad. And third, I'll tell you how to effectively discipline your child. Since you're watching this, I'm going to assume that you have an interest in your own personal development and that you're no stranger to working on yourself. Because of my passion for helping families thrive, I want to offer you my top 3 parenting tips. As I do, please consider the value of these tips in your relationship. Now, I acknowledge that even if you're no stranger to working on yourself, some people get defensive when it comes to talking about their parenting or being honest with themselves about their children's behavior. In order to get the most out of this video, I'll ask you to let me guide you in a little visualization. Before we start, go grab a piece of paper and a pen. Pause the video and I'll wait. Okay, are you ready? Great. Now that you have your writing tools, you can close your eyes now. Take a big, deep breath and just let it go. Do it again. Take another while keeping your eyes closed and listen to my voice. Take another deep breath, and as you do, allow your mind to find a situation with your child that you found frustrating. Maybe they were acting out, or throwing a tantrum, or yelling at someone else, or hitting someone. I don't know what it is, but you do. And in that moment, you couldn't relate to your child. Perhaps they were being extroverted, and you were being introverted, or the other way around. It doesn't matter. I'm wondering if you can see the scene in detail, and I wonder if you can step outside of yourself and see yourself in that situation. I wonder if you can notice what you over there is thinking about that and feeling about that while you stay over here with me. And then, when you are ready, you can open your eyes. Now, I invite you to write down all the thoughts, judgments, and opinions that you had in that memory. Go ahead and pause the video and take all the time you need to do this. Welcome back. I have a question for you. When you are outside of yourself, looking at yourself, I'm wondering if there is something you saw about your child or yourself that you would love to change. I invited you to do that exercise because I find that sometimes people have a hard time seeing the truth about the behavior of their children, or admitting to being embarrassed by their child, or ashamed of their own reaction, or don't like feeling helpless in the presence of a difficult behavior. I find that some people feel like a failure when all they really needed was help. I don't know why we can accept help in some areas, and in others we feel we have to know everything and have it all figured out. And I'm here to tell you, whether you're a first-time parent or a fifth-time parent, you don't need to know everything. When children think they now need to know everything, they have a hard time learning anything. Even if they dare to try something new, they're disappointed if they can't pick it up right away. So I'm going to ask you to be vulnerable, to be okay with not having all the answers, and to become curious about learning the knowledge, tools, and skills that can help you in helping your child to become their best self. Let me share with you something I observed watching my parents with my preschool teacher. She guided my parents and taught them how to be good leaders, but the credit doesn't just belong to her. They were coachable. They were open to her suggestions, and they recognized that she was a child care professional and trusted that she knew more than they did, and that she could be a neutral observer, that she could see things clearer than they could. Imagine, if you will, what would happen if we were all that open to support. So now that you've made a new distinction with your child or children, I'm wondering if you can admit to yourself that you don't need to have it all figured out. And then consider this. I'm going to assume that you, like me, want a better world. A better world for our children, for our future, and for ourselves too. I like to think that it would take only one generation to fix the problems of our world. One generation of children that didn't have to recover from their childhoods. Now maybe you're thinking, yeah, right, and how do we accomplish that? Well, the 3 things I'm about to share with you are a step in that direction, so let's get started. First, where do you start when your child's misbehaving? Now, believe it or not, some people think the first thing to address is the child's behavior, but that's based on the parent having an emotional response. It's perfectly natural, but for the parent that wants to be a successful role model, the place to start is always with yourself. It's an opportunity to show your child that just because we feel something doesn't mean we have to act on that feeling. So let me give you an example. While it's perfectly natural to get upset when your child is throwing a fit about their fit doesn't solve the child's problem or yours. That's why your response to their behavior is the place to begin before taking on their behavior. You de-trigger yourself so that you see what's really required of you in the situation. When I was a teenager, I was a nanny, and one of the little kids I watched hated to go down for a nap. It was always a really long struggle. And it was made worse by the fact that I allowed that struggle to frustrate me every single time. I got triggered. I pleaded. I snapped. And sometimes I yelled. Does that sound familiar? Years later, I found myself nannying again. Another little boy that also hated naps. He would cry, he would scream, and he would try to get out of that bed. The first day, I tell you, he cried for what seemed like forever, but I'm pretty sure it was only half an hour. It was awful. I tried to reason with him. I told him he was just fine. I started to feel sorry for him as I began to identify with his distress. I felt bad that I couldn't comfort him. And that night, I went home and cried about how helpless I felt. Here's what my mentor told me. He said to de-trigger myself to make it easier to deal with the situation. He urged me to see that when kids are spinning out and throwing a fit, their what he calls lizard brain is in control. He said their primal, emotionally driven brain had taken over their rational mind. He told me that when this happens, all they can do is be upset. He said no amount of reasoning is going to work with them. And in those moments, he told me to de-trigger myself so that I could wait out the tantrum calmly, compassionately, and patiently. So, the next day I tried it. When I went back to the house and the little boy began to cry at nap time, I set him down in his crib, and I went to the bathroom to de-trigger myself. I'll explain a little bit more about how to do that in a moment. Now, the key is to remember in those moments you are not abandoning your child. You're taking charge of yourself so that you can serve them better. I stayed in the bathroom and de-triggered myself, and once I was de-triggered, I went back in. I was then able to be a good friend and a role model to that kid. I went back in and scooped up my little buddy, and I rocked him and sang to him, and he calmed right down. And a funny thing happened that day. From that day forward, the fight about nap time totally fell away. It went from 30 minutes to 20 to 10 minutes and then to 5. He began to surrender to his fate and even enjoy it. But what if I had given up and given in that day? What would the child have learned from me then? Well, he might have learned that all he had to do was throw a fit and he could get anything he wanted. Have you ever had one of those moments where you couldn't see something through? De-triggering yourself gives you a solid foundation to stand on. De-triggering yourself makes working with your child's behavior doable, and I'm better for having learned that lesson. When a child cries now, I now know I can deal with a tantrum calmly and successfully. That's the awesome thing about dealing with a trigger instead of acting on it. It's almost as if when you stuff your feelings, instead of dealing with them, they become an emotional sore that just festers. So when the trigger comes up again, you're already sore, making your reaction more unpleasant than before. And you will always have an emotional response to life. But when you learn how to deal with them and move through them, you don't have to project them onto your kids. Now here's something interesting. I've noticed in my life that as I've learned to deal with my emotions, old reactions just sometimes go away. And while I may no longer have an emotional reaction to a kid throwing a tantrum, there's still plenty of things that upset and frustrate me. Believe me. But each year, it seems that they are fewer and farther between because I've learned to not act out my emotional response. I've learned to trigger myself until the trigger disappears. Which brings me to the second thing that I want to talk to you about. De-triggering yourself when your child is driving you crazy. I think it's important to remember whenever people get angry at their child, or anyone, or anything for that matter, their anger is the problem. So let me say that again. When somebody gets mad at someone or something, their anger is always the problem. They may think the problem is some other problem, but it's the way they're dealing with the problem that's the problem. Triggers are projections of assumptions and beliefs, which means an emotional storm is an opportunity to understand yourself better. Maybe even a chance to let go of a belief that limits you. Maybe an opportunity to be a better version of yourself. So if it seems that your child or someone else or anything else is pushing your buttons, you don't have to give your power away. Not if you take ownership over your feelings. And one of my favorite techniques, one that I use with my clients, is going into the storm. Not to be overwhelmed by it, but to move through it. Not to feed it drama, but to attain clarity. Not to do more harm, but to do more good. Sometimes I like to imagine that a person's original nature is a lit lamp. If you are that lit lamp and some of your experiences have caused your light to dim, it's as if pieces of fabric are being laid over your lamp. After a while, it can be really difficult to see your light anymore, to remember who you really are, which at your core is always a being of light and love. De-triggering yourself helps you access those pieces of fabric that have caused your light to dim, and one by one, you can peel them off and once again reveal your true luminous nature. So, you may be wondering, how does one go about dealing with a trigger? Well, the first step is determining if you're in a situation where you can deal with it right away. If you can, pause and always do that. Perhaps you can be honest with your child and explain that you'll deal with their behavior at a later time. If you choose to set down dealing with the behavior, then set a time, preferably on the same day, to deal with your child's behavior. When it comes to dealing with your trigger, you may want to find a place to be alone. I highly recommend it. It's best to be in your own energy and not worried about what anyone else is thinking or feeling while you're dealing with your trigger. Now, I'll admit it, I love the bathroom because I can talk to myself in the mirror just like I'm talking to you now. I walk back and forth, pacing and talking to myself. And during this time, if you can, scream! And if you can't, then quietly cry and rant about how crappy your life is. Now, most personal development people will tell you never to go into the negative, but I believe it's okay to do that as long as you're doing it to move through the problem and not to be in it. So trigger yourself, fuel the fire. Better to get all that stuff out than leave it in, I always say. Now, if you aren't alone in the house, don't worry. Kind of embarrassing, but I've cried in public bathroom stalls plenty of times, so I know it's possible to quietly cry and talk to myself. If you need more privacy and you can't be alone in your house, consider doing this in your car. But here's my disclaimer, never while you're driving. Driving and crying do not mix. And if you want to pull over somewhere in your car, make sure it's in an area where you know you'll be alone. I wouldn't want you to be embarrassed if someone saw you talking to yourself and screaming. So go ahead and cry. Cry until there are no more tears, until the fight has completely gone out of you. Doing this might take an hour or more, but even 5 minutes of releasing those feelings can make such a difference in your life and the life of your child. It takes a bit of practice to get good at triggering yourself. That's the challenge of it. A person's mind is great at protecting itself, and it can throw up all kinds of obstacles to keep itself from getting to the truth behind the trigger. I'd be happy to help you deal with this and access your feelings and your fears. And if that's your interest, I'll tell you more at the end of this video. Now, the next step, after you've released all this difficult stuff, then you're ready to shift into a new energy. So stepping into the storm is super important, but only if you intend to step through it. Of all the ways a person can change their mood, my favorites are dancing, music, listening to comedy radio on Pandora, going on a walk, and working in my garden. What are yours? What do you enjoy doing? What brings you peace? So, now you've de-triggered yourself and you've lightened your mood. This is the time to decide, does your child's behavior really require a response from you? Or was it just that you were triggered by their behavior? If something more is required to deal with your child's behavior, what might it be? And how might you go about it? Now is the time to think strategically. Do you need to involve your family? Another parent, perhaps? Does someone else need to be on the same page so that you can deal with this in a unified way? This last step in the process gives you a chance to model for your child how to deal with interpersonal conflict. In my opinion, modeling a desired behavior is way more powerful than trying to teach your child. Here's an opportunity to set an example as you communicate openly and respectfully with your kid, as you'd like to with any adult. And just as you would with an adult, you can make an appointment with your kid. If you have a teen, this appointment can be made around their schedule. And if you have a younger child, just give them a heads up about what's going to take place and when. For example, you could say, I'll be back in 5 minutes and we're going to deal with what just happened. And I want you to be thinking about it and why it happened and what it is you wanted when you behaved that way. By setting an appointment, you give yourself and your kid the chance to think about the events that took place and process your feelings about what happened instead of trying to deal with them in the heat of the moment. So far, we've talked about your emotional responses and how to de-trigger yourself in a stressful situation. Now, the last tip I want to share with you is about setting boundaries within which your child can make better choices. And to do that, I want to make a distinction between two loaded words known to all parents and all children. The first is punishment, and the second is discipline. But first, I feel that I must make an important differentiation between punishment and discipline. To me, punishment is arbitrary. Punishment is doled out in the heat of an emotional response to an undesired situation. Punishment is never a natural consequence of a choice on your child's part. Your child isn't learning anything, and you aren't teaching anything except to be afraid of a punishment or rebelling against it. Punishment is just that. It's meant to punish. Now, discipline is different, particularly when your child internalizes it as self-discipline or self-control. It's about creating a context where your child can learn. Discipline is creating boundaries and letting your child make choices within those boundaries. The choices made by your child then lead to observable consequences for their actions. Sometimes the consequences are good, sometimes they're bad, but all of them are connected to choices, just like in real life. And that is how your child learns. They may succeed or they may fail, but this is how their confidence grows. So now that we've made this distinction between punishment and discipline, let me illustrate both of them for you. If a mother tells her child, "You can't go to your friend's house because of how you talk to me. Go to your room for a timeout." Can you guess which this is? That's a punishment. And I can see several issues with this approach. First, there's no inquiry into why that behavior happened in the first place. And second, there's no opportunity for the child to make a better choice. So what's a better approach? If the same mother asks her child, "What's going on with you? That's not like you. You know I love you and you love me, and that's how we talk to each other. So what's going on?" Most of the time, acting out is the symptom of a bigger problem. Isn't that a good time for a time in instead of a time out? What I mean by a time in is a chance for parents to hold their children close and reassure them. This time in recognizes that a child doesn't need to be punished or isolated, but instead, they need to be reminded of how much their family loves them. Now, let's say the kid in the scenario didn't have a difficult day. The mother could still give her child a chance to make a different choice. She might say, "Well, I just want you to understand that if you talk to me that way again, you won't be going to the sleepover tonight. But if you talk to me in a loving way, I'll be happy to let you go to the sleepover. You decide how you talk to me." This both sets a great example and provides a boundary with consequences inside. If they talk like that again to their mother, they won't be going to their friend's house for a sleepover. If they talk in a loving way, they will be going to their friend's house for a sleepover. They decide. That is how you teach children cause and effect. That's how you teach them to think critically. And that helps them become better and more responsible decision makers. Well, as I promised, there are my top 3 tips for parenting. And if you're still with me, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. I love helping people thrive, and I truly believe that these tips can make a difference in your life and in your relationship with your child. And if you're ready to make a commitment to your own learning through your work with me, I'd love to start us out with a free coaching session. But please, do respect my time and only sign up if you're pretty sure that working with me is your calling. And when you come for that first session, bring a problem that you'd like for us to solve. We'll spend an hour on a specific issue, and if you like what I have to offer, then we will talk about continuing our relationship. So, are you ready? To see my offerings and sign up for that session, click on the button below. Or you may contact me directly at omigalucy@gmail.com. Please feel free to share this video with any parent that you think could benefit from it. Thank you again for watching. I send you all my love and many blessings to you and to your family.